In the first programme, we looked at how links between Scotland and Ulster go back hundreds, indeed thousands of years. And I thought that I had impeccable Catholic roots. But it turns out that my great-great-grandfather was a Presbyterian assistant farmer from Inishargy on the Ards Peninsula. And he had a wee bit of illicit cohesion, sharing and integration with a Catholic maid from a couple of fields away. Her name was Mary Ann Cleland. His name was Mick Cleland, both Scottish names. So it proves that I am just a wee bit Ulster Scot. Yes, the McClellands and Clelands probably came over in the early 1600s. And that's where we start the second part of our journey, as we take a close look at the Plantation. The Plantation is one of those historical events that we all remember with certainty and passion. Unfortunately, often that certainty and passion isn't backed up by any detailed knowledge of the actual events. Why? Because, well, it's Northern Ireland, and our current political views often colour how we view the Plantation.
Let's look at the facts. The Protestants, I think we would all agree, arrived here 400 years ago. They robbed the Catholic land. They drove us up to the hills like so many sheep. They did their best to brutalise our language, our culture, our traditions. Our struggle continues today to right those wrongs, and that struggle goes on, even, I suppose, as we speak.
I couldn't have put that better myself. These early settlers were fine, decent, hard-working Protestant stock. What did they find when they got here? They found a wasteland, a bog, as Kevin said, inhabited by semi-nomadic, non-English-speaking Roman Catholics.
Up to now, settlements in Ulster were haphazard and unofficial. This one was different. This was plantation as government policy.
The official plantation affected 6 of Ulster's 9 counties. Okay, you had Donegal, Tyrone, Fermanagh, Cavan, Armagh, and a county that was originally called County Coleraine, but then in 1613 became County Londonderry, and that was because the London companies, the great merchant
that name will never stick.
London, well, they were given responsibility for developing what became County Londonderry. Planning took place in London over a number of years prior to 1610 when it was rolled out. We see various categories of grantee. When we think of the plantation, we think of the settlements, they're the undertakers. And interestingly, they were the only group of grantees specifically forbidden to have Irish tenants. Now, that was the theory. And the theory, when it's devised in London, is very different from the practice when it's rolled out in Ulster. The theory was to have Irish removed from the undertakers' estates. The reality is that most of those estates were Irish.
This is the trouble with Irish history. It's too complicated. You see, I thought it was nice and simple that the Protestants came and stole all our land, but that's not how it happened at all in reality. So these Scottish settlers arrive in Ulster where they've spoken a different language from the native Irish. They have a different religion from the native Irish.
Yeah, well, they would overwhelmingly have spoken Scots.
But the Irish natives were speaking Gaelic Irish.
Oh yes, they would have been, that's right.
Thanks. The trouble with the Ulster Scots language is that most people don't think it's a language. Plus, it's too easy to mock. I mean, any second-rate comedian can do that. Does anybody here speak Ulster Scots? No, you all do. Why? Because it's not a language. The real language you need a good ear. With Ulster Scots, you need a straight face. The language, there's grammar and syntax and irregular verbs. With Ulster Scots, to learn it, all you need is a 6-pack of harp and a DVD of Rob C. Nesbitt. Now, Jackie, I'm one of those people you want to slap because I've been on the telly taking the hand out of the Ulster Scots, but you don't give me that look.
There's money's the time bag lad, I'd like to slap you across the beak.
This could go very badly. I'm not going to apologise. I'm going to tell you, I have taken the hand out of it, but I want to know, you think it is a proper living language? You're a native Ulster Scots speaker, aren't you?
As a language or as a dialect, you know, it's like saying as a daisy of fleur or a weed, there's a dandelion of fleur or weed, there's that sort of dividing line. Folk would say it as a dialect. To me, it was just my way of life. It's been so stigmatised here because English was brought in and the Ulster Scots was getting beat. You should be in school or whatever, and even talking to folk. But when you're in the schoolhouse, it was always standard English, and once you stepped over that door, went into the playroom, you switched automatic. And essentially, we're bilingual. We were bilingual.
You were bilingual?
We were bilingual even before bilingual was maybe even thought about.
In 1860, a teacher in Belfast named David Patterson was totally appalled by the pronunciation of words by people in Belfast. In fact, so appalled was he that he wrote a book with the astonishingly patronising title of The Provincialisms of Belfast and Surrounding Areas, pointed out and corrected. Yes, even 160 years on, you still want to slap him. He was very annoyed by the way that people were pronouncing their words. Words like gold, he said, were pronounced gould. Idiot was pronounced idiot. And whip was pronounced whop. Even worse than that, according to Patterson, these people actually made up words that weren't even in the Oxford English Dictionary. Words like skelf, meaning a splinter, or canaptious, meaning crabbed, or boke, meaning to listen to the Stephen Nolan show. These words were indeed, of course, Ulster Scots words that had their origin in Northumbria and then spread to the lowland Scots before coming here to Ulster.
We often think of the Ulster Plantation and the movement of Scots across the North Channel into our own province as being the most significant event in Scottish history of that era. But the reality was more Scots went to Poland in the early 17th century than came to Ulster. In fact, more Scots went to Scandinavia in the early 17th century than came to Ulster.
And did they bring anything else with them?
Hugh Montgomery established a school. There was also a playground or a green beside the school in which there was space to play golf, archery and football.
So you're telling me that we wouldn't have had Rory McIlroy or Jodie Best without the Ulster Scots?
It's very possible.
One aspect of the plantation we rarely discuss is the actual character of the planters themselves. The Reverend Blair from Bangor in 1623, well, he was frankly unimpressed, describing the new settlers as adventurers who had very little religion. And the Reverend Andrew Stewart from Donaghadee, he was even less impressed. He said that the new settlers were, and I quote, the rejected scum from England and Scotland. The type of people, he said, who were just fleeing debt or justice. Going to Ireland, he said, was the miserable mark of a deplorable person. Well, isn't that what we always say about new immigrants? But there were some really bad boys from the Scottish borders who came to Ulster.
James I clamped down on a lot of the clans, particularly the Grahams, who were the most notorious of the people he would have gone across and stole cattle and rustled sheep.
They were a bit lawless, were they, the Grahams?
They were extremely lawless. So a lot of them were hanged, and some of them actually, when they came over to Ulster, spelt their name backwards to try and avoid the authorities, and if you spell it backwards it's roughly Maharg.
Maharg.
So you find some Maharg certainly here in County Antrim. So they were really, really bad people.
Can you tell who was a planter and who was native by people's names?
It's very dangerous to make any assumptions about someone's religious affiliation or political allegiances based on their surname. You take, for example, McGuinness. You've got Ken McGuinness, Alban McGuinness, Martin McGuinness. You have people who have names that, you know, in our own preconceived notions, oh, he must be a unionist, she must be a nationalist, but actually, when you look at their background, it's much more complex than that.
We're all mixed up to some degree. Well, let me throw a couple of names at you then. Adams.
Well, Adams is a very much a Scottish name.
It's a Scottish name?
Yes.
Gerry Adams is an Ulster Scot?
Well, it's possible, certainly, but we do have to be careful with names in that sometimes we have names that are sounding very obviously Scottish or English, but may actually be an Irish name that has been anglicised in some way. So without delving into someone's own family history, it's
Duncan.
Well, again, Duncan would be a Scottish name. So
Hugo Duncan is an Ulster Scot. You heard it here first. Irish history has always been pretty turbulent, featuring wars, invasions, rebellions and quite a lot of brutality. But now another factor was added into the mix, and a very potent one: religion.
One of the false perceptions of the plantations with regard to the Scots, for instance, that they were Scots Presbyterians and exclusively Scots Presbyterians, that's not the case at all. Some were undoubtedly people who had sympathies with the Presbyterian system. Others were Episcopalians. Still others were actually Roman Catholics. There was a small but significant colony of Scottish Catholics at Strabane in the early 1600s.
Some people ask why Scots decided to settle here in Ulster. Well, isn't it obvious? In Scotland the weather is wet and miserable, whereas here Exactly 400 years ago, the Reverend Edward Bryce arrived in this village, Ballycarry. He was the first Presbyterian minister in Ulster. Indeed, the first ever Presbyterian service in Ireland was held here in the year 1613.
This is the church that Bryce preached in. He would have preached here from 1613 until 1636. The early Presbyterian ministers who came here into Ulster, almost, I think to a man, were all out of favour with the church authorities. But also there was, I suppose, the pull factor of these new settlements of Scots without ministers.
There are about 8 or 9 very influential Presbyterian ministers in South Antrim and North Down. At places like Bangor, Robert Blair is probably the most prominent of them all. But John Knox's grandson, he ends up in Temple Patrick. So these were Premier League guys who were coming across here at the time. And so that sense of Presbyterian identity, that starts to cause all sorts of problems, but not necessarily with Catholic Irish, with Anglican bishops.
The plantation may have been more complicated and messier than we imagine, but it undoubtedly fostered tension and resentment, both political and religious, with the native Irish. Eventually, resentment and anger boiled over. Rebellion broke out in Ulster in the year 1641. English settlers were massacred by the native Irish. Initially, these Scots settlers were exempted from attack, but very quickly the violence spread. There were massacres of Scottish settlers in Armagh and Portadown. This led in the following year, 1642, to a Scottish Covenanter army arriving to defend the Presbyterians. There were further atrocities on both sides. And then, just to add to things, civil war broke out in England. After a bloody civil war, King Charles I was defeated by the forces of Parliament. Their leader was a man who, even today, wouldn't get a pint in certain Irish bars. Not that he'd want one. Those Puritans. Catholics in Ireland used to have 2 pictures hanging on their living room wall, one of the Pope and one of John F. Kennedy, neither of whom is quite as popular as he used to be. One man whose picture would never grace a Catholic home is that of Oliver Cromwell, he of the famous massacres at Drogheda and other places. Cromwell is to Catholic Ireland what Osama bin Laden is to America. What I didn't realise, however, is that Oliver Cromwell wasn't much of a friend to the Ulster Scots either. Why? Well, during the English Civil War, the Ulster Scots made the mistake of supporting the Royalists. So when Cromwell arrived in Ireland in 1649, he also wanted to have a word not just with the Catholics, but also with the Ulster Scots. In December of that year, he defeated a combined Ulster Scot Royalist army at Lisnagarvey, just outside Lisburn. Oliver Cromwell famously told the Catholics that they could go to hell or Connacht. He then told the Ulster Scots that they could go to hell or Tipperary, which, to be honest, doesn't have quite the same ring about it. Cromwell had a list of 150 key Ulster Scots leaders that he was going to send on a trip to Tip. But then he relented and said that the Ulster Scots could stay as long as they paid large fines. Yes, as far as Cromwell was concerned, Presbyterians weren't the right sort of Protestants, but at least they were Protestants. When the short-lived English Republic came to an end and King Charles II came onto the throne, things actually didn't improve for the Ulster Scots Presbyterians. Yes, they were Protestants, but according to the established church, they weren't the right sort of Protestants. Indeed, all the Presbyterian ministers in Scotland and Ulster were expelled from their churches. The Ulster Scots had been badly treated by the Catholic King James II, plus the settlers had very real fears about a repeat of the massacres of 1641. So when revolution again broke out in England, it was clear whose side the Ulster Scots would be on. When King William of Orange arrived in the year 1690, the Ulster Scots supported him to a man. He arrived here in Carrickfergus Castle, and if you want to know what happened next, well, look at a gable wall near you. So Jackie, I don't know if you know, but I've found Ulster Scots roots. My great-great-grandfather are Clelands and McClelands from Inishargy and Nuns Quarter. So I am part Ulster Scots.
I'm starting to like you already, big lad.
Oh, yeah,
I'm starting to push your road after all these last times I slagged you off on the radio and on TV there.
We did some vox pops in town and asked people about Ulster Scots, and a couple of things emerged. We're doing a wee documentary about Ulster Scots.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm fluent on it.
Are you fluent?
Oh, I'm supposed to be a few tricks on that.
What about the Ulster Scots language?
Have a clue.
It's no more a language than Glaswegian's a language. That's the way I see it.
I don't think it's a language. You can't convince me it's a language. You just can't convince me. It's a make-up thing, I think.
In terms of the language, either they mocked it or they thought it was merely a dialect.
In all honesty, and I'm not trying to dodge the question, but I don't think it matters, because what I think is important about it is that it's a living thing that people here still use, and I think that should be valued. I think that there's a Scottish vocabulary, an Ulster Scots vocabulary that is entirely universal here, and I think what matters is that those things make this place feel special, make it feel different.
The 1600s had been extremely violent and traumatic. The 1700s were slightly less violent until the end of the century, but equally as traumatic. Throughout the century, the Ulster Scots Presbyterians suffered discrimination at the hands of the established Anglican Church, the Church of Ireland. Presbyterians were barred from public office. Their marriages weren't recognised. They couldn't even teach. And when they died, their burial ceremonies had to be in accordance with Church of Ireland rules. And to top it all, the Presbyterians had to pay the Church of Ireland a tithe for the pleasure of being discriminated against. And you know what Ulster Scots are like. That was bound to hurt. Persecution took many forms. The Reverend John McBride from the Presbyterian Church in Rosemary Street in Belfast had a few difficulties with the authorities.
From about 1703 to 1712, he was effectively on the run. The portrait here we can see on the wall of McBride. The Sheriff of Belfast came with some soldiers to arrest him, and McBride had been tipped off and escaped. And the Sheriff of Belfast, in seeing McBride had gone, drew his sword. He couldn't stab McBride, so he stabbed the next best thing, which was the portrait.
Ongoing persecution, a series of famines and rising rents, led many Ulster Scots to emigrate to America for a new life. Plus, let's face it, the weather was better as well. While many Ulster Scots fled to America, those who remained behind continued to suffer discrimination at the hands of the established church. Then the American Revolution broke out in 1776. It was led by the close friends and relatives of many of the people of Ulster, and this in turn led Presbyterians to becoming more radical. Then in 1789, the French Revolution broke out, and this radicalism became even more militant. In 1791, the Society of the United Irishmen was formed here in Belfast, and many of its members worshipped in this church. The United Irishmen's core support came from Belfast Presbyterians. Originally they wanted political reform, but when revolutionary France declared war on Britain, the government clamped down on the organisation, and the United Irishmen started to demand not reform, but revolution. In 1795, Wolfe Tone and Henry Joy McCracken, the leaders of the United Irishmen, came up here to McGart's Fort on the Cave Hill, and they swore an oath never to desist in our efforts to subvert the authority of England over our country and to assert our independence. 3 years later, however, McCracken was back on the Cave Hill, this time on the run, in hiding, after the violent and bloody failure of the 1798 rebellion. Many of the founding members of the Lindenhall Library were United Irishmen, but it's wrong to suggest that everyone in Belfast sympathised with them.
The society had to accommodate both the United Irishmen, the radical politics of the time, with conservatism. And there's a minute from around 1793 that says that while books on religion and politics are very important, these topics will not be discussed within the society because they were so divisive. In the same year that Henry Joy McCracken pledged himself to an Irish Republic, the Orange Order was formed in Armagh after vicious clashes between Catholics and Protestants. The United Irishmen said they wanted to unite Catholic, Protestant and Dissenter, but in the south the 1798 rebellion often descended into sectarian conflict. And whilst the rebellion in the north was mainly led by Presbyterians, certainly not all Presbyterians supported it. Thomas Russell was our second librarian. Because of his United Irishman activities, he was arrested on the library premises in 1796. Now, he wasn't released until 1802, and he had ended up in Fort George in Scotland. So he was, I think, the longest serving state prisoner at the time.
So it shows how dangerous government felt that he was. There was a real split between those who were friends of Russell and those within the society who had given money towards the reward for his arrest.
Like all wars and conflicts, the 1798 rebellion had its own small tragedies.
There was a local boy, 16-year-old William Nelson, who was hanged for his part in the rising. He's called the Ballycarry Martyr. The authorities believed Nelson knew who the key people were, and they wanted him to give the names. And because he was so young, I think, they reckoned he would be the one to crack, he'd be the one to break. He was brought back here with 2 other men who were flogged, but Nelson ended up being hanged.
At the same time as all this political turmoil, the greatest writer in Scots, Robbie Burns, burst on the scene. He wrote in the language of the Ulster Scots, and his own radical views reflected theirs.
Burns certainly was a leader of the movement to use what we now regard as Ulster Scots language, and to use the Scots. And a lot of his books were written actually in Scots and English, with translations, and some of them, in fact, for people who didn't understand the original works. Burns regularly sent pieces of his work to Belfast, and they were published in the Belfast newsletter.
Let me introduce myself. I am the poet Robert Burns.
The first book of Burns' poetry that was published outside of Scotland was actually published in Belfast. Burns had a huge influence on the rural poets and the movement known as the rhyming weavers. People like Samuel Ferguson, who wrote poetry based on their experiences of rural life in Ulster.
And cut you up a ready slick.
Burns' radicalism resonates with the radicalism of people in Belfast and the north of Ireland in the 18th century. His radicalism can be equated with the radicalism in the North American continent at that time when they were going through independence and the War of Independence.
Burns was an inspiration in politics and poetry. One man who took up both causes was the greatest poet the Ulster Scots ever produced, James Orr.
Well, James Orr is a very interesting figure in the history of the Ulster Scots community. The poet John Hewitt referred to him as having written poems that were better than anything written by Burns.
He didn't go to school at all, isn't that right?
He didn't spend a day at school in his life, and I think it's phenomenal that somebody who, never spent a day in a formal school environment ended up the most prominent poet of the Ulster Scots.
Don't be telling school children that now. So he didn't go to school at all, and he's one of the most famous poets that the Ulster Scots have ever produced.
Orr was involved in the Rising itself. June the 7th, 1798. He gives, I think, one of the best accounts of what happened for these people on the 7th of June. The preparations the night beforehand with the blacksmiths making pike heads and all sorts of things, wives baking bread for the men, wrapping them up, and he says they bake bread with tears instead of water. He refers how some of them, when they march towards Antrim, make a pretense of what he calls macking their burn, which is going to the lavatory.
Macking your burn? Like the sound of that, it's a new euphemism on me.
But they never come back to join the rear, we call them. He also reflects on the fact that it was a beautiful summer day, and when they got to Donegal, the Presbyterian farmers in Donegal had turned out as well, but they had turned out to harvest their crops. And he says, in trying times, maist folk you'll find will act like Donegal men on any day. And it talks about the aftermath of the battle. When they arrive home, they say to him, you've arrived safely, and the person says, I'm going to have to say it was somebody else forced me out. Better he swing than I on some hanging day.
The 1798 rebellion ended in total defeat for the United Irishmen. Their leader in Ulster, Henry Joy McCracken, was court-martialled and hanged in Cornmarket. He was eventually buried here in Clifton Street Cemetery alongside his sister Mary Ann McCracken. Mary Ann herself was a remarkable character. She was actively involved in the rebellion in 1798, and she adopted Henry Joy's illegitimate daughter and raised her as her own. As well as that, she was a radical for her time. She actively opposed slavery in Belfast. She was a feminist, but also, like many Presbyterians of her time, she came to accept the Act of Union.
They turned away from the idea of an Irish Republic, essentially. They moved more in the sense of social reform, I think. And it's interesting when O'Connell starts his campaign for emancipation, Catholic emancipation, which is really the last of the penal laws from the 1690s. Henry Montgomery, one of the main Presbyterian leaders, supports that campaign, and a lot of the Presbyterians support that because it's about equality in society.
During the 1800s, the Protestants of Ulster and indeed of Ireland became more pro-unionist. There are two reasons for this. First of all, the Church of Ireland ended its discrimination against non-conformists, and secondly, there was a religious revival led by this man, Dr. Henry Cook. Henry Cook, better known as the Black Man, presumably because he's green. Henry Cook effectively turned the Presbyterians of Ulster from being anti-establishment to being pro-establishment. Added to that, the campaigns of Daniel O'Connell for Catholic emancipation and then repeal of the Act of Union effectively associated Catholicism with nationalism. The politics of Ireland were becoming deeply sectarianised.
From the 1840s right up to today, the history and politics of Ireland has been us and them, nationalist versus unionist, republican versus loyalist. And like everything else, the history and culture of Ulster Scots has been seen through that prism.
With the introduction of the national schools came a single national curriculum, and of course the language of that curriculum was English. That meant that written Ulster Scots tended to die out, and spoken Ulster Scots came to be seen as the language of the rural and the uneducated.
If the native speakers didn't take the beard and we didn't get it into the education system, it will do it. It definitely will do it.
Didn't he take to the beard? What's that?
Sorry there.
The beard?
No. Not your speakers, didn't take it in beard, take it in board, being in beard. Beard use that there, beard there, that's right. If they take it in beard, the 11 language will die off. Well, just go, sort of thing. I would need maybe side subtitles here with Dean and beard, things like that there.
Sometimes we need to stop and take off our political glasses, our troubles tinged perspective on life, because it's not always about British versus Irish or unionist versus nationalist. If you set all the politics aside, what makes Ulster special as a province is the interweaving of English, Irish and Scottish cultural influences throughout the centuries. And I think that's something that we should all know more about and enjoy.
So we've come to the end of my Ulster Scots journey, and what have I learned? Well, I've learnt that our history is even more complicated than I thought. I've learnt that Scotland was named after Irish people, and girls from Nuns' Quarter aren't necessarily as pure as nuns. But what I've also learnt is that Ulster, historical geographical Ulster, has had a long-standing and incredibly close link with Scotland. It's not just the border or our accents that make us different from the rest of Ireland, it's our Scottish roots. Now that's not a political statement. It's just that I think that our Ulster Scots heritage is part of who we are. You can, of course, choose to reject that, but I think on occasion in future I will embrace my inner Ulster Scot. Now, as we say in Ulster Scots, it's time for you to make your burn, and then tell your friends to go and iPlayer this.
Cycling legend Sarah Story and Aussie swimming champion Thorpe are two of the big names lining up to play a question of sport in a moment. And a London derby, the Football League show with action and highlights on BBC One Northern Ireland at 11:40.